The animated media of Pokemon is interesting in how we really don't get different stories besides the story of Ash Ketchum. Now, you can have your opinions on whether you like that or not, but that's not the point here. The animated series follows a pattern usually. A new generation of games drop, Ash heads to that new region, takes on the challenges of that new region, and once he's done, he returns home. We really never get to experience other people's story in animated form that often. Every once in a while, we'll get something like Chronicles, or Specials, or some sort of movie tie-in, but nothing more major than that. However, starting with the 3D generations of Pokemon game, that's changed. Starting with XY and ongoing, Pokemon has started releasing animated medias to either promote or tie into the new generation of games that has nothing to do with the main animated continuity. These stories don't include Ash or his companions at all. Instead, they're completely standalone pieces of work that give you a different story from a different perspective. For the 6th generation of game, it was Pokemon Origins. For the 7th generation, it was Pokemon Generations. Both of these were great on their own right, and maybe one day I'll get around to reviewing them. So, we knew that we were going to get something for the 8 generations of game, and I was excited. And once Twilight Wings debuted, I wasn't just impressed by it, I was blown away. Produced by Studio Colorado, with the first episode debuting on January 15, 2020, Twilight Wings is different from the other two pieces of promotional animated media, as it doesn't really follow a single person like in Origins, and isn't just a collection of moments from the games like Generations is. Instead, it's a combination of two, with a collection of short stories all interconnected with a common thread, following the journeys of multiple people as they live their lives in Galar. That thread being the Corviknight taxi, and to a lesser extent, Leon. And I think this is a fantastic display of how in animated form, the Pokemon world can be made to feel, for lack of a word, real. There are a total of 7 episodes, and like I said, each episode we follow a different story that culminates in episode 7, where we get to see all the characters get ready for the final event in the series. There's definitely a focus on a specific story, which is why I said it's like a combination of Origins, which I'll get to when I'm reviewing each episode, but the show does a great job of showing the lives and characters of the people that we know from the Galar regions outside of their jobs. We get more insight into them as people, and it really makes the world richer by having a sense of reality, even in the world of fantasy. So, let's go through each episode one by one and really dissect this awesome piece of animated media. Starting with Episode 1, Letter. The first episode of the series doesn't start with a massive action focus like you'd imagine a Pokemon series would. There is action in this episode, don't get me wrong, but in this case, the action scene isn't the focus. Instead, we're watching the action from the same perspective as sick kids in the hospital, so we see and hear the battle from a distance too. The battle is between Champion Leon and Bee. The kid, John, who will also be a consistent through line in the story, is a bedridden boy who wishes to see the champion in action in person one day. And so, the episode is about how he, when given the opportunity to meet Chairman Rose, who's visiting the hospital, writes him a handwritten letter asking him this. And you might think, that sounds boring, but the show does a fantastic job of wringing out all the drama from this as it can. Because John spends too much time writing his letter, he misses the chairman entirely and has to chase him up the hospital as he's leaving. Tension is really created from just the cutting between the chairman and Oleana and John, who's running up the stairs, and when he finally gets to the top of the roof, they're gone. But like I mentioned earlier, a through line in this story is the Corviknight taxi. Earlier in the episode, when leaving the stadium to get to the hospital, we see the Corviknight hiss at the chairman, and we aren't explicitly told why. The driver of the Corviknight taxi says that it's because Corviknight only likes him. But in this moment, when John's at the top of the hospital, staring at the Corviknight taxi flying away, we see that that's not the case, as it hisses and turns around to allow John to meet the chairman. What's more is that it even stops John, who looks very ill, from falling down, shocking everyone including the driver. It even allows John to pet it, something that, in my opinion, it would never let the chairman do. It even blows John's letter towards the chairman so he can have it. The chairman sees how Pokemon gravitate to John is really similar to how they gravitate towards Leon, so he takes the letter and leaves. The theme of Pokemon understanding and humans helping them runs through all the episodes, but in this episode specifically, the fact that it's done through a Pokemon that the child doesn't even own makes the emotional impact even more. Episode 2 is separate, yet still very much connected to the first episode. Remember in the first episode when John is watching the match between Leon and Bea? Well, during that match, he cheers for Leon to win. And since we're supposed to be on John's side, it's obvious that we're supposed to cheer for Leon too. But episode looks at the other side of that by showing the consequences of losing such a high profile loss. After a loss to Leon, Bea, the person who will be following this episode and the fighting type gym leader of the Galar region, takes a break from being in the gym for a while to go train in the wild area. She trains Pokemon physically. She runs, she jumps, she does push-ups, and she does everything physically because to her, physical strength is very important. And from her workouts after the loss, we see that she believes that she lost because she and her Pokemon weren't physically strong. But as the episode progresses and Bea and her Machamp are inside of a cave waiting for the storm to pass, we can see how the loss affects her mentally. It's something that some of the games try to do nowadays, especially with people like Hau and Hop, but I really think it's done way better here. While Leon is celebrating, she isn't. And this contrasting experience we get to see in this episode is the reason I say that this series makes the world feel real. In the regular Pokemon anime or even in the game, once you beat a trainer, you move on. Sure, you could talk to them and get their post-match dialogue, but that's about it. It's very limited. Here, we can see how a big loss really affects someone. She's clearly frustrated, and after she's stuck inside a cave due to the entrance being blocked by some fallen debris, we see this unfold. Because she had accidentally left her phone in the Corviknight taxi that brought her to the wild area, she can't call for help and has to rely on herself and her Pokemon, but still, she tries to do everything on her own. It's not until she falls down in the cave and sees how beautiful it is does she realize that she needs to be more than physically strong. Sometimes, she should just relax and try to take in everything around her. That realization, along with the help of her Pokemon, is what leads to her finding a hole in the wall that eventually is used to get her outside of the cave into a really beautiful flower forest. I don't think it's a coincidence that she comes out into a flower forest, because similarly to John's purity and his love for Pokemon being rewarded by his letter being given to the chairman through the help of the Corviknight, so too is her newfound determination rewarded when the Corviknight taxi returns and drops the phone back off to her. The third episode is completely different from the other two, yet still connected to the first episode. This time, it's Hop, Leon's younger brother, watching the match between Bea and Leon. Hop and Leon have a great relationship, as we can see by how much Hop admires Leon and his Charizard. In fact, he's talking about Leon's Charizard so much that his Wooloo, who's next to him, feels hurt. Wooloo feels like his own trainer would rather have a Pokemon that can fly and breathe fire instead of him, and because of that, he runs away. And while Leon himself had nothing to do with that, like I said earlier, this series really delves into other people's perspective, so even Wooloo, who isn't directly involved with Leon, is still affected by him. The Corviknight taxi is used as more of a prop in this episode, and starting from this episode till about the last, the taxi is just going to be used as a prop. However, here still, the taxi is being used as a way to bring people and Pokemon together, as Wooloo eventually returns to Hop after seeing that Hop does like him just the way he is. Episode 3 also has something that, unless you read the interview with the director, you'd miss for sure. While the episode focuses on Wooloo, think about Hop and his life. Imagine being the brother of the most undefeatable champion. Imagine how daunting that must be for Hop, as he plans on being a Pokemon trainer later in life. Now, imagine if you're Tommy and John, stuck in a hospital due to an illness. You don't know when you're going to be released, and realistically, when you are, you don't know what your future is going to be. Two different situations which contrast the lives and struggles of two people. And how does the director of the series, Yamashita-san, show this? Room lighting. In the interview I mentioned earlier he gave with Pokemon.co.jp, Yamashita states that even in the scene when you're watching the same TV as in episode 1 at the beginning of episode 3, you can see that the room is generally bright because the brightness and color of the background music and sunlight are naturally different. I made such a contrast consciously in episode 1 and 3. A subtle yet brilliant contrast. When you look at the circumstances of both characters, while Hop is not in a hospital bed or anything, he still has to deal with how Leon affects his life personally. Episode 4 of the series seems to be a favorite of not only many fans, but also the directors and the music composers. I'm going to leave a link to the interview in the description. I highly recommend you check it out because there's a lot of great insight there. Anyways, this story isn't directly connected to the first fight against Leon. Instead, it's about Nessa, who lost in the tournament before she could face Leon to Milo, who, I forgot to mention, appeared in the last episode. This story, in contrast to the other 3 so far, is more about showing off not only the life that gym leaders lead outside of their profession, but also how they have their own struggles. In this case, it's shown that she's been losing quite a bit recently, and after her most recent loss, Chairman Rose implies that Nessa's job as a model might be interfering with her ability to become a good trainer, and that she should consider focusing on just one. By the end of the episode, she comes to the conclusion that no, her being a model isn't interfering with her being a gym leader, and that she'll continue to do both and be great at both. And how does Nessa come to a decision like that? Like I said earlier, this series is not just one perspective, it's multiple. That also includes Pokemon, not only Wooloo, but in this episode, Feebas. And this episode, more than any other, shows that being the case. When she was younger, she told a Feebas that was hurt that it should show them what for by evolving. And now, in her moment of hurt, this Feebas that she encouraged has evolved into a graceful Milotic, and now is encouraging her. A Pokemon that's both powerful and beautiful, which is also an allegory for her. A simple episode, yet wonderfully done. Episode 5 of the series is similar to Episode 4. It follows, however, someone who isn't really front and center in this series all that much, and that person is Oleana, the Vice President of Rose Tower. While she has been present in all episodes up to this point, she's usually just a background character, following the chairman around and doing secretary things. Here, we get to learn more about her. We get to learn that she's a scientist as well. She was a leader in the research of Dynamax, and during her research, while the other scientists didn't think they were getting anywhere and left her, she persisted, getting the attention of the most powerful man in Galar. But even with a vice president position where she doesn't really have to get involved with the day-to-day if she didn't want to, she still does. We see her helping in all facets of the company, and through both the past and the current montage, we see that she's an extremely hard worker. So much so that she has people wanting to be like her and constantly get her to help them with things. It's obviously an exhausting position, but she doesn't complain, doesn't get angry. Even after leaving work only when it's nighttime, she's called straight back to work, and even still, she puts on a calm face. It's only at the end of the episode where she tries to tell the taxi driver about the difference between Gigantamax and Dynamax, and he tells her to be quiet, that she says that she doesn't know how long they can take this, hinting at the fact that the stress is getting to her. It's interesting that she says this now because later on, we'll find out that this series is also a bit of a prequel for the events of the game. So is this the reason why she turns a bit crazy at the end of the game? Possibly. The 6th episode is when the story gets back to John and Tommy. Unfortunately, I do think this is the weakest episode in the series. That doesn't mean it's bad by any means, far from it. I just think it isn't as highly produced as the other 6 episodes. This episode is about Tommy trying to apologize to John for saying that his dreams of being a Pokemon trainer is impossible. That being especially so because they don't even know when they're going to be discharged from the hospital. However, Tommy got discharged before John, so he wants to make it up to him by trying to get him a ticket to Leon's match. Onion, and yes, that's his name in Japanese, I'm not kidding, says that maybe he should apologize in person, and so Tommy, with the help of the Corviknight Taxi and Alistair, is able to sneak inside the hospital and apologize to John. So, it's a pretty straightforward story. However, this episode also raises a lot of questions, particularly regarding John and Tommy's illnesses. Why were they both in the hospital? What did they both have that they didn't have the recovery time to? In dialogue, Tommy makes it sound like they have the same illness, whatever it is, but he gets out much earlier than John does. Why is that? The hospital setting and John and his mysterious illness leaves a lot more questions on the table than it answers. The only answer I could find is that this device here we see is called a TENS unit, and it's used to treat nerve pain. So maybe that's what it is, but that's just speculation. And yes, Tommy does end up apologizing to John, letting him know that he'll be a great Pokemon trainer and Tommy will be there to support him. And in a nice show of continuity, the director of the series posted this image on Twitter, showing both John and Tommy starting their Pokemon journey. and the Pokemon they start with are related to this episode, since Tommy has a Dreepy thanks to Alistair's influence, and Rookity for John from the influence of the Corviknight. The main theme of this particular episode is friendship. Friendship between John and Tommy, friendship between Tommy and Onion, and to end the episode, the friendship between Leon and Sonia. This episode also ends with Leon getting the letter that John wrote at episode 1, setting up the final episode. Episode 7 is the final episode, and it's where it all comes together. So far we've seen all the gym leaders, but besides Nessa, Alistair, and Milo to an extent, they've only been given background cameos. That changes here. Well, sort of. It's the night of the World Championships, and reporters are asking about the champion to the various leaders who are participating in this tournament. And even though it's small lines, it does do wonders because it tells us about their character. Kabu is stern and serious, Bee is also serious but in a more practical way, Piers doesn't like having cameras on him, and so on. They all respond to some degree of the champion is strong and it's hard to know if he's battling seriously or just for fun. This also happens to be the TV special that is the reason that John is obsessed with Leon, because he saw a champion smiling, something he didn't think that was possible. And so we see the transition from a small fan to a huge fan, and this transition also serves as a bit of a time leap as John has finally received his release from the hospital. However, the letter he wrote to Leon seemingly didn't come true, as seen in his daydreams, causing him to run late to the Corviknight taxi waiting for him outside. Now, what happens next is a bit bizarre. Narratively it works to justify how John is going to meet Leon, but the problem is, the setup is so contrived that it feels almost random. Leon is training in the mountain in the middle of nowhere because if you played the game then you know that one of Leon's defining characteristics is that he gets lost. But here in this situation, he's literally hours from a massive match and he's in the middle of nowhere. And as he says, he's facing a tough battle, so he doesn't even want to tire out his Charizard and fly there. So if the Corviknight taxi didn't come, what was he planning on doing? I'm assuming he was going to use Charizard, but does that mean he would have delayed the match further until his Charizard recovered? Because as we can see from Rose's reaction, it's not like he can do anything about the situation. Even he just shrugs his shoulders and is like, whatever. Leon comes off more reckless than naive to me here, and I don't think that's a good look for the character that our protagonist looks up to like that. But hey, I guess that also makes him more human. The episode ends with Leon getting to the stadium and having an epic battle with Raihan. It's basically the battle from the intro cinematics of Sword and Shield, except this time, John gets his wish of wanting to see Leon's battle close fulfilled. Not only is he getting to watch the match in person, but he's in the battlefield itself as it happens. And we can presume that this is what inspires him to take on his own journey. The episode ends with the player character from Sword and Shield, Gloria and Victor, using the Corviknight taxi, telling the audience that you can also achieve your dream this way with your own adventures. And this works both if you play the game and if you haven't. If you have, it's a nice cameo that ties the series together. If you haven't, then it can be interpreted that two different trainers are about to start on some journey, and all of this is connected with the threat of the Corviknight taxi. The only issue here is the letter. The letter got its own episode to start the series. The letter shows up in almost every episode leading to the final episode. Episode 6 even ends with Leon receiving the letter. But when it comes to the final episode, the letter isn't even mentioned. It's not even seen, and since Leon didn't know the face of the person who sent the letter, he doesn't really respond to it like he knows John. You could argue that Leon saw the letter and knew who John was, because at the end of the episode he encourages John like he does know him. However, that theory in my opinion doesn't stick when you think about how John just told him during their flight that he wanted to see a match close up. Since we know that Leon's wish is to have everyone become a great trainer, it seems like he's just encouraging a kid regardless of who it happened to be. So yeah, I really wish they did something with that letter. It builds and builds and builds and ultimately it leads to nothing. And that's really unfortunate because this episode is fantastic in my opinion. I can't talk about this series without discussing the animation. When it was announced that Studio Colorido was going to be producing this series, I researched some of their prior work and was really impressed by their ability to use simple designs and colors. But I was also worried because I didn't know if that would translate well into Pokemon. Luckily, it does, and those design elements are still present in this series, boasting probably the best visuals Pokemon has ever seen. I'll get some of the negatives out of the way so I can rave a bit more about the animation. The only issue I had with the animation in this series is some of the 3D work. I know how hard integrating 3D into 2D animation can be. A lot of times, it can make or break the immersion in the shot. And for the most part, the 3D work in this series is a high watermark. However, there are moments where the 3D just doesn't work well. In most episodes, it's small enough not to notice. But in bigger shots, and I'm thinking specifically in episode 7 as Leon and John are flying through the air, we get some 3D shots that just feel out of place. It's not bad by any means, but it's just one of those things that I can't really explain unless you go watch it yourself. It just doesn't feel like it belongs, which is unfortunate because if you look at some of Studio Colorido's other work, their flying scenes look amazing, so it's unfortunate that it doesn't work as well here. Now, on to the positives. Some of my favorite animated moments aren't even the action moments. They're some of the low-key moments where the art does all the work. For example, in episode 1, when John sees a Corviknight taxi, we see this fantastic shot of some of its feathers coming off a Corviknight. It's basically a throwaway bit of animation, but to me, it shows how much care was put into this series, making a shot like that look so spectacular. Character moments are also done especially well, and we've seen that in the second episode when they show the training montage, or the fourth episode when they show Nessa with all the Pokemon. Almost every episode, the character animation is just fantastic. Even the environment looks gorgeous in almost every episode. And even the action, even though we don't get a lot of fight scenes in the series, the ones that we do get are amazing. The shot of the Charizard Gigantamaxing comes to mind, and it's one of the first times where I really felt like the scales of these things. This, combined with the wonderful storyboarding in each episode, crafting scenes and angles that aren't boring to look at, makes it such a wonderful watch. All of these moments are just enhanced by the color choice and the simple designs and the focus on making things feel more real, whether it be small background details or just a high level of animation fidelity, and I think the show wouldn't be half as good if it wasn't for this wonderful animation on work here. Music and sound in the series is great. Unfortunately, I'm no expert in music, so I can't tell you what things are supposed to mean in terms of music or what motif some piece of music has. All I can do is talk about how I felt about the sound design. The series has a very distinct sound. The recurring themes at the end of every episode defines the series here, and this series isn't afraid of silence either. There are lots of moments when there's no real music playing in the background, instead letting things like the sounds of the environment, echoing footsteps and the like do the work. In fact, one of the more memorable pieces in episode 5 is, as Olivia is heading down the streets of Winden, we get to hear music being played by an accordion with Mr. Rhyme tap dancing to it. It's not some sort of elaborate music piece or anything, but for some reason, and I suspect it's because of the environment that the music is being played on, it's a very memorable piece. The series also tries to give distinct themes to each character, and while some are more memorable than others, it still gives personality to each of the different characters, as the music also gives us an insight to them as a person. The best example of this being, like I mentioned, episode 4. Nessa gets a soundtrack that defines her. Such a wonderful sounding theme that is really fun to listen to. It takes place in the moments as she's rediscovering herself and extends till the end of the episode, and because of that, the soundtrack really sticks with you and reminds you of her anytime you see her in the series. The ending theme, similar to the Corviknight taxi, is the one through line that makes it all the way through the episodes. Because of that, it's a really enjoyable and memorable listen as well, so overall, I love the sound design in this series. So there we have it, my long-winded thoughts on the series. This series legitimately made Galar so much more interesting. It gave personality and backstory to many of the characters in Galar. I think this is especially true for the characters that got focus episodes, those being Nessa, Oleana, and Bee. I love the cameos and Easter eggs in this series. I love the story of John and his dreams in this series. I love how real it makes the Galar region feel. Comparing it to the animated series, it doesn't feel like things are frozen in time until some character causes some action to happen. It feels more like everything in Galar is happening at once. Everyone has their own lives, their own struggle, and their own moments of triumph. Things aren't happening in a vacuum. Everything is affecting everything else as it would in the real world. In fact, the only person who I feel like time stood still for is Leon, unfortunately. Episode 6 does try to remedy this by having him have conversations with Sonia on the phone as he's in Rose Tower, but the rest of the time, it's hard to gauge what he could even be doing. And honestly, I do wish that the series explored him a bit more. Leon, since episode 1, is treated as this mythical figure. He doesn't lose and everyone's affected by him in some form or fashion. And I can understand the fear that if you take an episode to explore him, you risk losing some of that mythical quality, but I think it was a mistake. Everyone in this series is shown to be human. Even Oleana, who I thought was the most boring character in the game, manages to have great depth to her character. I'm not sure what the proper way of going about making an episode with him as the main character is, but because we don't really get to know much about him in the series, aside from he's strong and gets lost, he feels a bit hollow compared to everyone else. Also, the story expects you to have played the game or at least be familiar with a lot of the game's character. That's most likely just a choice made in order to allow for the story to be told without having to give exposition to each character, so I think I'm fine with that. I just think that if you watch this on your own, you might not feel as invested in these characters as you would if you played the game. But still, in the grand scheme of the story, it doesn't really matter. This was clearly a labor of passion, and it shows. I'm sure that the pandemic made things hectic for them as they were in the middle of making the series when it hit, but they overcame that challenge and gave us a wonderful show that we won't forget anytime soon. And that is the real achievement of Twilight Wings.